All right, last week we began our look at chapter 2, and I think we had covered a goodly bit of it. We'll review in chapter 2, the outline covers the birth of Christ. We again especially noted Luke's penchant for setting the time, telling us of the Caesar who was there and the reason why, because of some political reasons, why Joseph needed to go to his ancestral city and to be counted. We spoke about the angels that appeared to the shepherds that evening that Jesus was born, in that night. And there was a public announcement to a limited audience. But that's one of the things we'll find is a number of public but limited announcements of the things of Jesus and John, his forerunner, as these things go. And so it's interesting, the exact words that the angels sang in chorus to the shepherds, those were remembered. And now again, I do realize that certainly God could have given the inspired record of exactly word for word what was said without anybody having remembered it or recollected it at all. But you think about the shepherds on the hillside. What do you think is one of the first things they did the next morning when they realized what had gone on? Don't you think somebody would have recorded that? Somebody would have told the story? And so when Luke comes and, as he says himself again back in chapter 1, investigates everything carefully, he's able to find out what the angels said. And the shepherds, with those words on their lips that night, go immediately into town, and they find everything just as it was announced. Of course, if an angel announces a thing, what would you expect to find? Just as the angel announced, yes, we would. And they praise God for those things they saw. Then we talk some of Jesus being presented in the temple, and the aged saints, Simeon and Anna, each come and give prophecy and praise as Jesus was being presented there in the temple. And again, we don't know how broad the audience for that would have been, but it was publicly done. And so at least the other people in the line taking their babies as Jesus was being taken by his parents as their firstborn, the other parents presenting their firstborn children, they might have had opportunity to hear these things. But again, the mercy of God for these two aged saints to realize that what they had hoped for had come. They wouldn't certainly live long enough to see Jesus' ministry, but what will they know that's in the generation to come? That for which they had so fervently hoped. And so that was done, and the presentations were given in the temple as should have been done for the redemption of the firstborn, various sacrifices. Of course, we recall that they gave the sacrifices of the turtle doves, which were the least expensive of the sacrifices, and that was a substitute sacrifice that the poor could use when they couldn't afford the regular order of things as far as sacrifices and offerings go. And so that's one of the indications of how the family lived and their social and economic status at the time of the birth of Jesus, that they give the offering that the poor were able to give. So God in his law always made mention of and made provision for the poor. And so when certain sacrifices and offerings were made, they certainly didn't have to bankrupt themselves, in order to do that. We think that's one of the things of oppressive religion and cult-like behavior, where people are made to offer oppressive amounts and to give really hardship amounts to the organization. But we do know that then they must have been poor if they needed to avail themselves of that situation. Of course, that also helps tell us something of the timing of the story in Matthew's gospel. Matthew tells the story of the wise men, or the magi, who come. And what do they give the family as gifts? Gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, we all understand that gold is quite expensive, right? And even today, though, can you buy some frankincense and myrrh? And is that stuff cheap? It's not cheap even today with industrial processes and commercial farming and commercial production. And so if you want to buy those oils, those are quite expensive even today. And so one of the things we can very well presume, at the time when Jesus was presented in the temple, who had not shown up yet? The Magi, they hadn't come yet, right? Because if you have gold in your pocket, do you take the offering that the poor get to make? If you had gold in your pocket, what would you do? You'd give the regular offering, right? You wouldn't take the poor option. And so that helps tell us again that the Magi weren't there immediately. And actually, also from time indication, in Matthew chapter 2, when Herod finds out that the Magi had gone away without reporting to him where the child was, what age of children did Herod slay? All the ones from 2 and under. Now, he was probably cutting a wide swath to make sure he certainly got the child, but it's probably closer to the 2 years number before the Magi get there than it would have been to that night. So somewhere in between. So all those pictures you see of the nativity scene, I guess if you wanted to recreate that, I guess you could, but you'd have your local farm animals. But one thing you don't have, if you want to be accurate, is you wouldn't have what? You wouldn't have the wise men. You wouldn't have the wise men there certainly that night or anytime quite recent. So we also note that those gifts, those costly gifts, would have been well needed and well used by the family. It's not told in Luke's gospel, but it is told in Matthew. What did the family do when the Magi left? What did the family do in Matthew 2 when the Magi left? They headed out for Egypt. They were warned that it was dangerous to stay, and they went to Egypt. And if you're going to take an immediate trip out of the country, what would it be handy to have? Gold would be helpful, right? Why didn't they just take their Judea Express traveler's checks? Of course, not such thing back then. So no traveler's checks, no credit cards. Not a single luxury. Oh, sorry, that's a different story. So they had these goods, and they were able, that helped them to go, and they were provided for in their time of exile until after Herod died. So Luke skips all of those and just tells us of the family's return back to Nazareth. And so in Luke's gospel then, since we had told most of those stories, we have the curious story of the only event in Jesus' youth. Now, spurious gospels, fanciful writings of Christians, especially a number of Gnostic gospels that were written after New Testament times, they all like to tell a number of stories of Jesus' youth. But aside from this one, the Scripture is entirely silent, and that is the time when Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, or was left behind in Jerusalem by the family. And when they got back to him, what did they find? They found him in the temple. And Steve, is that what you said as well? Okay. And what was he doing in the temple? Looking at the beautiful architecture? No. Right. Discussing the scriptures with the priest, with the leaders, with those doctors of the law. And what was their assessment of Jesus' knowledge at 12? It was an amazing knowledge. And Jesus made a declaration to his parents when they asked him what he was doing there. And what did Jesus say he was doing? He was doing his Father's business. tending to his father's house. And so there's an idiomatic expression there that's variously translated. He had to be in his father's house, which meant he was taking care of the business of his father. When it comes to the development of Jesus, when it comes to the development of the mind of the one who was the Son of God in the flesh, that has been the subject of endless speculation by many a theologian and non-theologian alike. And what do we know concretely about it? That he did. Yeah, as the last verse of the chapter would say, he grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So he grew in mind, he grew in body, he grew socially, he grew spiritually. In all the aspects of life, he grew. Beyond that, I think you'd just be simply trying to explain a miracle, and I think you'd have just about as much success as explaining how does water get to wine. Well, God said so and caused it to happen, right? What if you tried to explain that? Good luck, and it almost certainly would result in heresy if you tried. I think the same thing with so many of these questions of Jesus, the nature of Jesus, the mind of Jesus, the development of Jesus. The scriptures give us a basic outline, as we have said over and over about these early chapters of Luke, a credible telling of incredible events, but to go beyond that, I think, would tread dangerously. Ben had his hand, and then Steve.
When you think what's there in verse 48, when Mary's kind of shaking her finger at him, why have you treated us this way?
Right.
Your father had to look for you. Christ immediately responds with, he had to be about his father's business. I wouldn't think that that's a shot at Joseph, but he's not talking about it.
Oh, no.
He's referring to something that said in the birth they didn't understand. It just makes you wonder how much of what kind of relationship, I guess, him and Joseph had.
Right. I would imagine, I'm sorry, James, for the moment. I can't imagine a sinless son. Sorry, James. What if you had a sinless son, what would the relationship be with the man who raised him as a son? And you think about Joseph, and we know nothing of him except for a man of discretion and a man of faith. What little bit of known, that's from the story, little bit of stories of Joseph. He wanted to put Mary away privately. He's a thoughtful man and not any kind of cruel man. And you think about God. How many houses in Israel does God have to choose from to have the Christ come? Well, all of them. And he chooses this one. And from what we know of Mary, do we think he made a good choice? Well, absolutely. And from what we know of Joseph, what do we think about God's choice there too? And so you think about the man to whom God would entrust the raising of the Messiah to come. And Joseph knows that he is that, right? Joseph knows that. And so as a faithful man of discretion, how would you treat that child? And also, Jesus, as he grows, and never sins, right? Never sins. And how do you think Jesus would have treated Joseph?
There's no question how Christ was acting.
That's right.
But just imagine trying to be Joseph. Difficult that must have been to balance all that. There's the other children too.
Right. He's got 4 other sons, right, that are named, and he's got daughters, plural, that are mentioned. They're mentioned in the plural. So there's at least 6 children behind Jesus, right, in the family, and possibly 1 or 2 more than 6, if the numbers of daughters are the same as the numbers of sons. This is a well-blessed household. One of the things we see in this, and as I've been studying Luke, especially right now, in our country, aside from the presidential election, what's been we got several. I was going to say, what's one of the other things being discussed very regularly, if you keep up with political and current events, it's been the judgeship, right? The nomination, the hearings and confirmation about this woman who was put into the Supreme Court in the last couple of days. And, there's several notable things about her. She's a Catholic woman. And what's her family like? There's a lot of them, right? Is it 7 children? So 5 of her own, 2 adopted. I knew 2 were adopted. I couldn't remember how many natural children. She's a woman of great accomplishment while being an apparently successful mother to this large number of children. And the only people in our society these days who have large families, nearly always, are religious families. All right? You can almost just draw a line on any demographic chart. More religious, larger family. Why is that? Mormons, Catholics, conservative Protestants, Orthodox Jews, observant Muslims, all of those people have more children than the average. Why? All of those groups whom I just mentioned understand and treat children as a blessing from God. And this story starts with, like so many Old Testament stories does, a family that wants what? A family that wants children. And so here is Joseph, and he has this large family. Whenever he goes around town, he's got 7 children with him, right? And what would everybody in the community say about that? Man blessed of God, right? There is a man on whom God has shown his favor. And when we think about the household where Jesus was raised, and raised in a way that God would hope and expect, and understanding their unique role, how would God bless that family? He would bless them greatly. And I think about, like, in the Old Testament a couple of times, there's a family who's given guardianship of the Ark of the Covenant. What happens when they are faithful guardians of the Ark? Greatly blessed. What would we think of Joseph's family as he's safely guarding the Messiah in his youth? Wouldn't we expect them to be greatly blessed? And so they want children. They want children. They've got children. They're greatly blessed. And so, just imagining the day-to-day details of how that would work out. Let everyone be convinced in their own mind because the scriptures don't deal with it. But if we do give that much thought, well, we think that's probably a pretty good house, isn't it? That's probably a pretty good place. I would also note that I don't think that on a regular daily basis, prior to his ministry, Jesus did a whole lot of things that just regularly demonstrated his divinity. And the reason I come to that conclusion is when he did begin his public ministry and show himself, certainly at least at the minimum, to be a prophet of God, and start people wondering, is this the Messiah? What was the reaction of all of his brothers? They were shocked. They thought he was crazy. And they went to go get him and bring him home quietly, right? Sort of like what Joseph did when he first heard about Jesus being born. He was going to put Mary away quietly. What did his family do when they found out what he was doing and all the crowds that were attending to him? They went to go get him and bring him home. And they didn't have a big confrontation about that. They sent word in, hey, we'd like to see you. And what did Jesus say about his family? My family is the one who does the will of God. And so, yes, I know these people. I love these people. But when it comes to family, this is my family. So I don't think that Jesus was just every day, again, prior to his ministry, doing things that caused everybody to go, oh, he must be divine. Because the people closest to him didn't recognize that at the time, but at least several of them, we know for sure, did recognize that when it was fully revealed. Yes?
I got a question in my mind that I've had for a long time, and I've never really gotten an answer to it. And it was along similar to what we're talking about here, is at what point did Christ divest himself of his deity as a child? Was it at the point of conception, or was it the point where the child was born, came to mind was whatever point it was that Christ humbled himself enough to put all that aside.
Right.
For us, and he loved us.
That's right. Now, when you said divest himself of divinity or of deity, I think we can say, and I think it's proper to say, he was always divine and always deity, but he did not exercise the prerogatives or demand the rights of deity. So,
When I said that, I'm talking about, he put it all aside.
right, he
He took the form of humanity.
That's right. So he, because I think of just a quick example, if a king doesn't dress in his royal robes, doesn't drive with his motorcade, doesn't take out his armed guard, if a king just dresses in normal street clothes and goes out and walks the street, goes down to the ice cream cone and buys an ice cream cone from the vendor, he has used none of his powers, his rights, or his privileges, but he's still the king or the prince. But if he wanted to, in a kingdom, he could take the royal entourage, he could take the royal robes, he could walk down the street so that everybody would bow when he walked by, everybody would clear the sidewalk as he came down. And in the kingdom, he could say to the owner of the ice cream shop, what? Give me one of those. Make it a double scoop, right? And what should the shop owner do? Yes, sir, your majesty, here's your ice cream. So he's still the king. Jesus, in a like way, divests himself and does not use the powers, prerogatives, honors that are due him. At what point should people have worshiped Jesus? Every time they recognized who he was. But he didn't. Did he go around saying, bow, sir? Or not, sir, he wouldn't say. He'd say, bow, peasant, bow, underling, bow, human. You know, he didn't do that at once, did he? What if he had done that? He would have been right. He'd been absolutely right. It wouldn't have been so helpful for us, maybe, right? Could have caused a lot of problems and resentments and the like. So Jesus, when he comes to earth, as this translation says in Philippians 2 and 6, he was in the form of God. And I think he was very God, as one of the old creeds says. But he didn't consider equality with God a thing to be exploited, or some translations say a thing to be grasped. He didn't use that godness that he had, but he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, and then I think in a parallel explanation, taking in the likeness of humanity. And when he had become a man, he humbled himself, being obedient even to the point of death on the cross. So he humbles himself entirely, uses none of the rights and privileges he had, and it seems like the entire time he's here, from the time that he restricts himself to human form, which I would think would be from conception and through birth. And people sometimes think about the infant Jesus, deity in the cradle. But I mean, imagine deity in the womb. He's still Jesus. He's still the same one. He has those rights and powers, but for our sake, he emptied himself of what he had, and he poured himself into this form of a servant. He emptied himself of that which, those honors and positions and privileges, and became as humble as possible and obedient as possible, humble and obedient even to death. And so, to me, the whole time he's in human form, he is certainly constrained, and again, voluntarily constrained, in a way that if he were indeed, in the form of whatever he was in heaven, he would not have been. There's occasional times when glimpses of that power, prerogative, position break through and are shown, revealed. The most obvious case is the Mount of Transfiguration, so that he just shines up on the whole mountainside, or the case where he raises himself from the dead. Of course, I know the Scriptures also affirm that God raised him, and I know the Scriptures also affirm the Holy Spirit is active. But as he says in John 5, I lay down my life that I can take it up again. We might be so humble, we might be so loving and so full of service that for another we would lay down our life. We would give our life for another person. because we love them that much. But what can we do next? Well, pretty much that's it, right? We call that the ultimate sacrifice. We call that the final act because there's nothing after that that we're in charge of. Jesus lays down his life, then what's his next act? Resurrection. Resurrection. So, I would think he's constrained. He's emptied. He's in this humble form for the entire experience of humanity. And again, trying to explain that, I think, if you look at the ancient creeds, and if you look at the ancient heresies, from about the year 200 till about the year 700, every one of them just about has to do with explaining something about the nature of Christ and the way he's in the flesh, and then that being pronounced as anathema by that generation or the next generation. And once or twice, the creeds and the anathemas switch. Well, they decided one thing and then they decided something else. And so it is an area fraught with landmines to try to explain beyond what the scriptures affirm. Did that help or did that make it worse? Did that answer your question? I'm going to say the whole time he was in human form, he was in this humbled state.
It's kind of hard to fathom being an all-knowing, all-powerful God, and then taking the magnanimity of that and squeezing it down.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Was that present in an embryo, or was it? I don't. That's one of the questions. You can ask the question, and you'll never really get an answer to it.
No, yeah. One of the things that struck me is, and this is the last time that this was widely visited, and the Protestant reformers, Luther and Calvin and those followers pretty well agreed with this, and no one spent a lot of time until the Jehovah's Witness going back and retreading this. But it became very clear with the creeds and doctrinal statements that it was important to say that Christ had one mind. There's a unified mind of Jesus, but he had two natures. He had a divine and a human nature both. It's like, well, that'll work for me. But then if you said he had one nature but two minds, that was a deep heresy. So the current state of, what's heretical or not, it generally is one mind, two natures. And make sure you get those straight, because don't say two minds and two natures, don't say one mind and one nature, and don't say one nature and two minds, because all those are wrong. You're supposed to say one mind and two natures. And exactly the metaphysical and spiritual logic by which people came to those conclusions, which that conclusion pretty well seems right to me, and then anathematizing everybody else who concluded otherwise. Wow, you spent a lot of time on that, didn't you? But that is the current state of what's considered orthodox and what's considered heretical. One mind in Jesus, and two natures, a divine and a divine and a human nature.
I think it would have to be everything that we would understand that God described what life can be, and if he went through all things that he did, it would have to be
Yes.
to the point.
The book of Hebrews, he was made in all points like we are.
Yeah, and so he went through the 9 months pregnancy.
He did.
The
Yeah.
progress that he had as an infant, I don't
Right.
know, but when he fell, it was probably in his knee, my assumption.
What,
He never had a woman. So, he had that felt physical change. At some point, did God Almighty say, this
Right.
this is ridiculous.
Right.
But I know down the road, this
Right.
is nothing compared to
Right.
what I'll go through then.
Yeah, he would have had a 2-year-old developmental stage, probably with Jesus, not the terrible twos, but just the twos. But he would have had a 3-year-old development stage, and he would have had a kindergarten stage, and he would have had whatever language a kindergartner has versus whatever language an 8th grader has, or whatever. and how that works out, we find him at 12 being most impressive. And we find him at 33 being perfect, or 30. We find him at 30 being perfect. And so that the scriptures affirm, that I can say too. Let's look at the questions of chapter 2, unless there's more. Number 1, why did Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem? For the census. So blame it on the government. So they had to go for the census. They went to the ancestral home. Number 3, how was Jesus' birth announced? By angels. Angels singing on the hillsides. What was the shepherds' first reaction? They're frightened. And what is their next recorded reaction? Yeah, they go they investigate and they worship and praise. 4, why'd the family go to Jerusalem about a month after his birth?
Dedication.
They went to the dedication. They went to the gifts and sacrifices that the law required. What kind of man was Simeon, the man they met there? Righteous, devout man. And what was promised him? He would not die before we saw Jesus. I call these the 2 aged saints. It's usually presumed from that Simeon is older. Normally you don't talk about a fellow, this won't happen until you'll see something before you die. Usually you're older, so we presume he's older. And what did he do when he saw Jesus? He held him. And he offered praise and thanks. What about Anna? What was she like? Oh, yes, she was. At some point, that becomes your distinguishing characteristic, right? What are they like? Oh, they're old. But she's also a righteous and devout lady, right? And what did she do? She stayed in the temple, and we find also from her praise and it says gave thanks to God, to speaking of him of all who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. So I don't know if they had a redemption of Jerusalem club that they met with, but she knows other faithful people, and she's telling them all, I saw the Christ, I saw this baby, and it was indicated to me this is the one. What was the teacher's reaction, 8, the teacher's reaction to youthful Jesus? They're amazed, that's right. They're amazed at his knowledge, his understanding. Why did he say he was in the temple? To be about his father's business, that's right. Tend to the things of God. And also we'll note, teaching, that's a good way to tend to the things of God, right? Teach the things of God is tending to the things of the business of God. And 10, how did Jesus progress? There in 252. Wisdom and stature, favor with God, and favor with man. So there's the scriptures define 4 different areas of growth. Wisdom, so the mind is developing and you're getting smarter. Normally, with Jesus, it's almost, how do we say he got smarter? But increasing in the knowledge and experience. Stature, which that usually, if you feed somebody a good diet, that'll take care of itself, right? Favor with God, so the spiritual things, and favor with man, so the social things. And so you think about the things of which you're concerned, or maybe we're concerned, if the children are mature now, with your own children, right? Are they growing? Are they learning? What's the report card look like? But also, what's the spiritual development look like? Right? Are they learning about God? Do they have the right attitude toward God? And also, don't we care about how they favor with man? Don't we care how well do you play with others? Right? And so how can you get along with others? Do you know how to deal with people? And if you think about those things, which one is most important for getting along in life? That's a trick question because they're all kind of important, aren't they? They're all kind of important. And if one was stunted in any one of those areas, they'd have serious issues in life, wouldn't they? And so those are the things of which Jesus did progress, just as parents look out and hope their children do as well. All right. Additional, it's a minute or two till additional things before we close tonight.
Well, one thing that we, as much as we could look coming up on the time of the year that it is, we still do not find the date per se
True.
when this event took place. I've heard it said that because when the shepherds were out in the field, so to speak, it may have taken place sometime around October.
Right.
That this event may have taken place, but to say it happened when the world religiously said it happened, no, it doesn't. It could have been December
Right.
25th, but more than likely not.
Right. The climate there is mild enough that late December times in the fields are possible. They're not the most likely. So the most likely, and also I think in the summer, I think it may be, I've heard that it's possibly it's too dry, I'm not sure. But usually when people try to nail down a date, they normally come to spring or fall. I have seen some people go to, and it's a little bit theoretical, making basically every important event in the life of Christ to match up with a Jewish feast day. And I think there's one of them that's oddly vacant, like the rest of the calendar. There's something happens at every one of these feasts, and they say, well, so obviously he was born at this one, and it completes the cycle. I'm not sure if Jesus was throughout his life and ministry, trying to hit for the feast cycle or not. So that's a little speculative. But yeah, we just simply we don't know with certainty the time of Jesus' birth. We know the development in the church and the eventual settling on December 25th as the date. And there seems to be some reason besides just good evidence. There seems to be some reason to have that as a date besides just biblical proof. And so, no, we just really don't know the date. But people like having a date, so one was picked. I'm kind of glad they picked the middle of winter because we put the lights up when it's the darkest. And so it works well at that time. But certainly there's nothing made of the date as far as doctrinal importance or as far as church importance in church practice. And so I think like Romans 14, you observe one day as special or just one day as every other. That's up to you and your own conscience.